The waiting room smelled like antiseptic and old magazines, something clinical but tinged with the faintest hint of sadness, like a place that held too many goodbyes. Outside, the wind whipped through the bare branches of late November trees, rattling the brittle brown leaves still clinging stubbornly to life. The sky was a dull, heavy gray, the kind of winter afternoon where the light feels too weak to reach into the deepest corners of the soul. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, each second stretching longer than the last. Inside, a woman sat clutching a folded jacket around her knees, her breath shallow, eyes fixed on a small black cat curled into a ball in the cage beside her. The cat's eyes were half-lidded, glazed with exhaustion or pain, but when they flicked open, those eyes, sharp, emerald green and fierce, caught her with a quiet intensity that unsettled her. She wasn't supposed to be here, not today, not now. Her name was Claire. A soft-spoken woman with eyes rimmed red from sleepless nights, her fingers trembling just slightly as they brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear. This was the third shelter she'd visited in 2 weeks, the last place she wanted to be. But here she was. Not by choice, really. She was running out of time, options, hope. She glanced down at the black cat again. There was something about him, something fragile but unyielding, that pulled at a part of her she hadn't even realized was still open. The vet had said he was sick, real sick, the kind of illness that whispered its own death sentence. Claire's hands tightened into fists. She had come prepared for this moment, ready to say goodbye, to end the pain. The papers for euthanasia were already signed. She had fought long enough to save him. She had no more fight left in her. But still, as the minutes ticked by, something held her back. The cat lifted his head, his ears twitching, and for a moment, his gaze caught hers. Not fearful, not resigned. Something else, like a question or a challenge, a small, almost imperceptible defiance. She leaned forward, her breath catching as the cat's whiskers twitched against the cold metal bars of the cage. His fur was patchy, matted in places, and the scars on his nose told stories Claire wasn't sure she wanted to hear. But despite it all, he was there, still breathing, still fighting. Outside the shelter window, the first flakes of snow began to fall, dusting the cracked pavement with cold white. Inside, the dim fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the quiet hum underscoring the stillness between them. Claire swallowed hard. The room felt impossibly heavy, as if the world was holding its breath. This was the moment everything could change, or end. She didn't know yet which. The shelter smelled of cleaning supplies, damp concrete, and a faint trace of catnip. It was not a place of miracles, but of realities. Claire had worked in nonprofits for years, mostly helping people find homes for their pets. But today, she was on the other side of the glass. She'd lost her own cat, Luna, just 6 months ago. Her companion through the long nights after her divorce. Her quiet anchor in a world that felt increasingly fractured. Luna's sudden illness and death had left a hollow so big it swallowed whole days and sometimes entire weeks. Since then, Claire had drifted, haunted by silence and memories. She had tried to fill the void with work, with friends, even new hobbies, but nothing touched the part of her that had loved so fiercely and lost just as deeply. When she heard about the black cat at this shelter, a cat no one wanted, too sick and scrappy for adoption, something stirred inside her. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe something simpler, a desperate hope that in saving him she might save herself. So here she was, an emotional wreck, holding onto a thread that felt impossibly thin. The black cat's cage was at the end of a row, tucked away from the bright center of the shelter, where kittens played and families laughed. He was an afterthought to most, a shadow among shadows. But to Claire, he was suddenly everything. His breathing was shallow, and his tail flicked restlessly. When she spoke softly to him, her voice cracked like old paper, but he seemed to understand. His ears pricked, and he stretched one slow paw toward her, claws clicking softly against the metal. That small gesture felt like a lifeline. Claire's eyes brimmed with tears. She saw the scars on his nose, thin, faded lines that told a history of fights, scrapes with the world. The faint twitch of his whiskers when a stray breeze brushed past the door. The subtle twitch of his tail when a loud noise startled him. He was scared, but he was still there. She remembered the last time she'd seen Luna, curled up on the windowsill as the winter sun dipped low, purring softly, trusting the world to be kind even in its quiet cruelty. This cat didn't have that trust yet. Maybe he never would. But maybe, just maybe, Claire could give it to him. The vet finally appeared, her white coat crisp, her face calm but tired. She looked at the chart, then at the black cat, then at Claire. "It's really time," she said gently. "He's suffering." Claire nodded, the weight of the moment settling like a stone in her chest. She had come prepared for this. She had said her goodbyes already in her mind. But when she looked back at the cat's fierce green eyes, something cracked inside her. She wasn't ready yet. Maybe she never would be. The vet started to prepare the necessary paperwork, but as she turned to leave the room, the black cat suddenly let out a low, hoarse growl. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp, filled with raw, unexpected strength. The vet froze. Claire held her breath. And then, something changed. The snow outside thickened, blanketing the world in quiet white. Inside the shelter, time seemed to slow. Thus was no ordinary goodbye. This was the start of something no one could have anticipated. Claire didn't know it yet, but the black cat, wounded, fierce, unbroken, was about to turn her life upside down. The first night Claire brought him home, the black cat barely moved. She named him Ash, after the faint gray flecks in his fur that caught the dull light, like remnants of a forgotten fire. His body was fragile, thin with scars and weakness, but his eyes, those sharp, green eyes, were alive. Not with the reckless spark of youth, but a slow burning flame that seemed to flicker cautiously in the dim room. Claire had cleared the corner of her small apartment, setting up a soft blanket in the quietest nook near the window. Outside, the city was muffled under a fresh layer of snow, lights shimmering through the frosted glass, distant and indifferent. Ash was silent except for the occasional soft cough that shook his frail frame. The vet had warned Claire he might not last long, that even the best care might not be enough. But the moment he stepped onto the warm carpet, he stiffened and then, almost imperceptibly, lowered his body to the ground, as if testing the new world cautiously. Claire sat on the floor across from him, her fingers trembling as she extended a hand. The smell of his fur was a mixture of damp earth and something faintly metallic, like rusted metal left out in the rain. She whispered his name, and he blinked slowly, the way cats do when they are trying to say, "I'm not afraid. Not yet." For hours, he stayed curled, barely eating, too weak to explore. But Claire didn't mind. She watched him like a mother watches a newborn, measuring every breath, every twitch of a whisker. The silence between them was heavy, but not empty. In the following days, Claire found herself adjusting her life around Ash. The soft clink of the tin can opening, chicken-flavored pâté mixed with a little water to make it easier for him to swallow, became a small ritual. The smell of the food filled the kitchen with a sharp, tangy aroma that seemed to stir something deep in Ash. At first, he sniffed the bowl warily, lowering his nose just enough to lick a few tentative bites. His claws scraped lightly on the wooden floor, a sound that surprised Claire because it felt so delicate, like a whisper. Slowly, he ate more each day. He developed small habits that Claire noticed with growing affection. The way he curled his tail tightly around his paws when he settled into the blanket. The faint tremble in his whiskers when the wind rattled the window panes. The quiet little cough that seemed to punctuate his breaths, reminding Claire of the fragility she had promised to protect. Claire herself was a study in contrasts. She moved through her days in a kind of fog, caught between exhaustion and a quiet urgency. Her nights were the hardest. Sleep came in fits, haunted by dreams of Luna and a past she couldn't quite let go. But Ash, in his quiet, broken way, was pulling her out of that fog. He was a living, breathing reminder that life still had small, imperfect miracles left. Even in sickness, even when everything felt like it was slipping away, he reached towards something that might still be worth fighting for. One evening, as Claire sat on the couch, a book forgotten in her lap, Ash made a sudden movement. He climbed unsteadily onto her chest, kneading with his paws in a slow, rhythmic motion. His claws, though sharp, were careful, almost reverent. His breath was warm against her skin, ragged but steady. Claire closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. For the first time in weeks, she felt a crack in the loneliness. Here was a creature who needed her, who trusted her enough to be this vulnerable. There were moments when Ash's true personality flickered through the weariness. One morning, Claire woke to find him perched on the windowsill, eyes wide and alert, watching a squirrel darting across the snowy yard below. His tail twitched with excitement, and for a moment, he was a wild thing again, sharp and alive. He was a hunter at heart, despite his weakness. That instinct never left him. Even as he coughed and rested, the spark of curiosity and caution stayed. Another time, when a thunderstorm rolled in and the apartment filled with the low rumble of distant thunder, Ash hid under the couch for hours. Claire knelt down, her voice soft and soothing as she reached toward him. He didn't come out, but when she stroked the floor near him, his tail flicked tentatively. She understood then that the trauma of his past wasn't just physical, it was etched into his very being. Slowly, they settled into a fragile rhythm together. Claire would come home from work and find Ash waiting by the door, his eyes following her every move. He still coughed sometimes, the sound ragged and alarming, but he fought to stay with her. One rainy evening, Claire found herself talking aloud to him, sharing memories she hadn't dared voice before. "I thought I was done," she whispered, her voice cracking. "After Luna. I didn't think I could love again. I wasn't sure I wanted to." Ash blinked slowly, head tilting as if he understood the weight of her words. "But you," Claire continued, tears spilling, "you're different. You make me want to try." She reached out to stroke the rough fur on his neck. He leaned into her hand, a soft purr rumbling in his throat, faint but real. Ash's small victories were Claire's salvation. The day he managed to climb onto the sofa without help, she laughed aloud, a genuine, unguarded sound she hadn't made in months. When he followed her from room to room, his movements slow but determined. Claire felt her heart lift in ways she didn't expect. But there were harder moments, too. One afternoon, Ash suddenly stopped eating. His usual cautious sniff at the food bowl turned into a refusal. His breathing grew more labored, and the familiar cough deepened into something more urgent. Claire panicked. The fear that had lurked beneath the surface exploded. She scooped him up and rushed to the vet, clutching him like a precious broken thing. At the clinic, the vet examined Ash carefully, her face grave but compassionate. She spoke in soft tones, explaining tests and treatments that might help, but Claire could hear the hesitation beneath her words. Ash's body was fragile, his illness unpredictable. The vet mentioned new possibilities, experimental treatments, but warned of risks. Claire felt herself caught between hope and despair, each breath weighted with the possibility of loss. Yet, as she sat beside Ash's cage in the clinic, she saw something else, a spark, faint but persistent. Ash looked up at her, eyes steady, not defeated. It was then Claire realized the bond they shared was no longer just about saving Ash. It was about saving herself. Returning home, Claire set up the treatments the vet prescribed. The apartment filled with new smells, medicinal and strange, mixed with the lingering scent of warm blankets and wet fur. Ash tolerated the routines with a patience that surprised Claire. At night, he curled against her, his body thinner but no less warm. His paw would occasionally reach out, brushing against her hand like a silent promise. Claire learned the subtle language of his needs, the way his tail twitched when he was nervous, the soft hum of his purring when comforted, the way he flinched from sudden movements but relaxed when she whispered gently. With every small gesture, every fragile step forward, Claire felt the walls she'd built around her heart begin to crumble. Ash wasn't just a cat. He was a mirror reflecting Claire's own pain and resilience. Each breath he fought to take was a defiant act against a world that had tried to write his story as one of defeat. And Claire, for the first time in a long time, felt that maybe, just maybe, there was more to their story than the silence of loss. One late afternoon, as the sky outside faded into a soft purple dusk, Ash did something unexpected. He limped into the living room, head held high despite the obvious pain, and nudged Claire's hand with his head, a gesture so small yet so filled with meaning that it caught her off guard. She dropped to her knees, overwhelmed by the weight of the moment. In that simple touch was a question, an invitation to keep going, to believe in the impossible. Claire wrapped him in a blanket, holding him close as the room grew dark around them. The steady rhythm of his breath, the faint pulse of life beneath fragile skin, filled the silence with hope. The bond between them was no longer defined by weakness or fear. It was a promise, a shared journey through pain, healing, and the stubborn spark of life that refused to die. As the snow fell softly outside, covering the world in quiet white, Claire and Ash settled into the fragile beginnings of a new life, and neither of them would ever be the same again. Claire woke to the dull ache in her chest before she even opened her eyes. It was a familiar weight, pressing down harder since the early morning hours, when Ash's quiet cough had escalated into something raspier and more alarming. She had spent the night beside him, watching his fragile chest rise and fall, each breath a reminder of how precarious their fragile peace was. The apartment was still cloaked in the gray half-light of dawn, the edges of the world blurred by a dense fog creeping along the streets outside. Snow had softened to a slush that dripped from gutters and stained the sidewalk in dirty patches. Ash lay in the middle of the living room floor, his body thinner now, ribs more pronounced beneath the patchy black fur. His eyes, still sharp, were clouded with exhaustion. Claire reached out instinctively, brushing a trembling hand along the thin curve of his neck. "Hey, boy," she whispered, voice thick with sleep and worry. "How are you feeling?" Ash blinked slowly, barely moving except for the faint quiver of his whiskers. Then, in a sudden motion that caught Claire off guard, he limped toward the kitchen doorway, halting awkwardly on 3 legs. The other hind leg was clearly bothering him, a subtle but noticeable limp, something she hadn't seen before. Claire's heart tightened. She followed him cautiously, every step deliberate, until he stopped near the cluttered space by the radiator where she kept his medication and soft food. He crouched low and began to paw at something on the floor. Claire leaned down, her breath catching. It was a small, shiny shard, metallic and sharp, partially hidden beneath the baseboard. Her mind raced. Where had it come from? Could Ash have stepped on it? Was it the source of his limp? She swept the shard away carefully and checked Ash's paws, her fingers trembling as she parted the fur and examined each tiny pad. Nothing obvious, no bleeding or open wound. Yet Ash limped still, and the cough had grown harsher. Over the next few days, Ash's condition seemed to worsen in small, frustrating increments. The limp grew more pronounced, his appetite waned, and Claire could see the flicker of fear in his eyes whenever he tried to move. She grew more protective, setting up small ramps for him to climb onto the couch or his blanket, guiding him gently as he learned to compensate for the injured leg. But Ash resisted assistance with a stubbornness that both frustrated and saddened Claire. There was a moment when he refused to eat for almost a full day, turning away from his food bowl with a look that felt like silent protest. Claire stayed by his side, speaking softly and stroking his fur, but the distance between them felt wider than ever. One evening, a sudden episode shattered the fragile calm. Ash, normally cautious and subdued, bolted across the room as if chased by a ghost. His body trembled, and for a terrifying moment Claire feared a seizure. He crashed into the side of the couch, knocking over a lamp, then collapsed in a heap. Claire dropped everything, rushing to him, her heart pounding in her throat. She cradled Ash's head in her hands, feeling the ragged rhythm of his breath against her palms. His eyes flickered open, wide, and filled with panic. The next morning, Claire made the decision she'd been dreading. She bundled Ash into a carrier and took him back to the vet, the city's damp cold seeping into her bones as she hurried through empty streets. The vet's office smelled sterile, but no less comforting this time, like a place where fragile lives were fought for in whispered battles. The doctor examined Ash carefully, running his hands over the limp leg and listening to his lungs. Tests were ordered, X-rays, blood work, and an ultrasound. Claire sat in the waiting room, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her mind swirling with worst-case scenarios. Hours later, the vet returned, her face drawn and serious. "There's more going on than we first thought," she said softly. The X-rays showed a small mass near Ash's injured leg, a shadow, irregular and dark. The blood work revealed signs of infection, and the ultrasound confirmed something else, a lesion near his lungs. Claire felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Cancer, infection, something serious enough to threaten the fragile life she had fought so hard to protect. But the hardest part was watching Ash's reaction. He lay on the exam table, weak but alert, and as Claire reached out to comfort him, he suddenly stiffened. His gaze locked on something behind her, or perhaps inside her, filled with a wild, ancient fear. Then, with a sudden burst of strength that seemed to come from nowhere, he bit gently but firmly into Claire's finger. Not out of anger, but desperation, a plea she couldn't ignore. Claire stared at her bleeding finger, tears burning her eyes. He was telling her something, but she didn't know what. The vet's expression softened. "This little guy is stronger than he looks," she said quietly. "But we need to act fast." Back at home, Claire struggled to process the news. The apartment felt colder, emptier. Ash was quieter now, retreating into himself as if bracing for a storm. Yet despite everything, he still sought her out, pressing his fragile body against her side, purring faintly like a heartbeat she could cling to. One afternoon, as Claire sat on the floor, Ash crawled onto her lap, resting his head against her chest. She felt the steady thump of his heartbeat, irregular but alive. The weight of her grief and hope pressed down on her, a complex knot of emotions she couldn't untangle. Then, one night, something extraordinary happened. Claire was reading when Ash suddenly bolted from his bed and rushed to the kitchen. A loud crash echoed through the apartment. She followed him quickly, heart pounding. Ash was pawing frantically at a small puddle of water on the floor beneath the sink. The pipe had burst. Water was flooding the cabinet, pooling on the floor. Ash was soaked, but persistent. Claire grabbed towels and shut off the water, grateful for his sharp instincts. In that moment, she saw him not just as a sick, fragile creature, but as a brave, loyal companion fighting alongside her. They were both wounded, both scared, but neither was giving up. Days turned into weeks, and despite treatments and setbacks, Ash's spirit remained unbroken. Claire's love deepened into a fierce protectiveness, a promise to fight for every precious moment they had. But the battle was far from over. Then came the night Claire would never forget. Ash was restless, pacing the apartment with a strange urgency. His eyes darted toward the bedroom door, then to the window, ears flat against his head. Suddenly, he froze. Claire saw it then, a small, dark shape slinking along the windowsill outside. A rat. Ash hissed low, his body coiled like a spring. Without hesitation, he leapt at the window, claws scraping the glass. Claire's heart jumped. Despite everything, despite his pain and weakness, Ash was alert and fierce, guarding the home they'd made together. But the next morning, Claire found him collapsed near the window, breathing hard, his injured leg dragging painfully behind him. The vet was called immediately. Ash needed surgery. Claire sat by his side in the sterile, quiet room, the weight of the decision crushing her. Would the operation help, or only prolong the inevitable? As the anesthesia took hold and Ash slipped into unconsciousness, Claire felt a fierce, desperate hope mingle with the rawest fear. She squeezed his paw, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Ash's fight was her fight, and whatever came next, they would face it together. The hospital waiting room was cold and unforgiving, the sterile fluorescent light humming overhead like a drone, unyielding and harsh. Claire sat slumped in a plastic chair, clutching Ash's soft blanket to her chest as if it were a talisman against the unknown. Outside the operating room, the ticking clock measured each agonizing second. Ash, frail and fragile, had slipped beneath anesthesia minutes ago. The vet had promised it was the best option, that surgery might give him a fighting chance. But at that stillness, Claire felt every possibility, the hope, the dread, the raw ache of impending loss, twist inside her chest like a thorn. Her mind raced back to the night she first saw him in the shelter, eyes wide and wary beneath the harsh fluorescence. The black cat with patches of gray like ashes, broken but alive. She remembered how his first hesitant paw prints left marks on her heart, so light, so tentative, like promises whispered in the dark. Now, hours later, she sat in a room devoid of warmth, waiting for a miracle. The vet appeared suddenly, her face tired but calm. "The surgery went as well as we could hope," she said softly. "There were complications, but Ash is stable." Claire's breath caught, relief and fear tangled in her throat. "He'll need to rest and recover here for a few days," the vet continued. "We'll monitor his lungs carefully." Claire nodded, the tightness in her chest easing just a little. Later, when Claire finally saw Ash, he was curled on a soft bed beneath a pale blue blanket. Tubes and monitors surrounded him, his breathing slow but steady. His eyes flickered open briefly when she approached, and despite the haze of medication, recognition sparked. He blinked at her, green eyes gleaming faintly with the stubborn life that had carried him this far. Claire reached out, her fingers trembling as she brushed a stray whisker from his face. Ash responded with a weak but determined purr. In those long days of recovery, Claire never left his side. She talked to him in quiet tones, reading aloud stories she remembered from childhood, or sometimes just telling him about the small details of her life, what she'd eaten for lunch, the rain outside, the way the city smelled after a storm. Ash listened, sometimes nuzzling her hand or pawing gently at her sleeve, the faintest comfort against the loneliness. Each small victory, his first tentative sip of water, the slight wag of his tail, the way he stretched a bit further each day, became a triumph. The vet marveled at his resilience, noting how Ash refused to give in despite everything stacked against him. Claire saw it too, the stubborn spirit beneath the fragile exterior. One evening, a nurse brought Ash's food tray to the bedside. The smell was sharp and unfamiliar, but Ash's ears perked up. With surprising strength, he nudged the bowl forward with his nose, then began to lick at the food. Claire smiled through tears, feeling a surge of hope. As Ash grew stronger, he began to show pieces of his old self, the fierce hunter who had defended their home from a rat's intrusion, the cautious survivor who'd endured pain and loss. One afternoon, when the nurse left the door ajar, Ash attempted to stand on his own, wobbling unsteadily but refusing to give up. Claire steadied him with gentle hands, her heart swelling with pride. During one quiet moment, Claire noticed Ash's gaze drift toward a window overlooking the hospital courtyard. Outside, a soft snow began to fall, the flakes drifting lazily through the pale light. Ash's eyes tracked the slow dance, calm and peaceful. Claire knelt beside him, whispering, "We're going to get through this." He blinked slowly in response, as if agreeing. After nearly a week, the vet finally gave Claire the news she had hoped for but dared not believe. "Ash is ready to come home," she said, a faint smile softening her face. "He still needs medication and care, but he's stable." Claire's hands shook as she packed the supplies, the weight of the moment settling deeply. She had fought for this fragile life and now had to carry the responsibility forward. Back in their apartment, everything felt different. The walls no longer echoed with silence, but hummed with the quiet life they shared. Ash, though still weak, moved with more confidence. Claire set up his favorite corner by the window, where the afternoon light pooled warmly on the worn blanket. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the city lights flickered on, Ash did something that left Claire breathless. He climbed onto the couch and, with a careful, deliberate motion, settled on a pillow that had belonged to Luna. It was a small, quiet gesture, but full of meaning. Ash's head rested softly on the fabric, and for the first time since she'd lost Luna, Claire felt a gentle warmth spread through her chest. It was as if Ash was saying, "I'm here. I'll keep you company." The bond between them deepened in those silent moments. Claire watched Ash curl into a tight ball, his breathing slow and even, his fragile body finally at rest. She reached out, her fingers tracing the curve of his back, feeling the steady pulse of life beneath the fur. Tears slipped down her cheeks, tears not of sadness, but of profound connection and gratitude. In the days and weeks that followed, Claire and Ash built a new routine, one filled with small joys and quiet triumphs. She learned to read the subtle signs of his needs, the twitch of an ear signaling discomfort, the soft hum of a purr indicating contentment. Ash, in turn, seemed to understand her too, offering gentle nudges when she was overwhelmed, curling beside her on the coldest nights. One afternoon, Claire found herself standing at the window, watching the city stretch endlessly beyond. Ash hopped onto the sill beside her, his green eyes catching the light. In that moment, Claire felt the weight of everything they had endured, the loss, the fear, the uncertain future, and the quiet strength that had carried them through. She whispered softly, "We've come so far, haven't we, Ash?" He blinked slowly, the faintest purr vibrating in his throat. Claire smiled, the kind of smile that reaches the eyes, warm and honest. They were no longer just survivor and caretaker. They were family. The past no longer defined them. Ash's scars, both seen and unseen, were now marks of resilience, badges of a life fiercely lived. Claire's heart, once fractured, was healing in the presence of this small, brave creature. In the quiet glow of that evening, as snow fell softly outside, Claire understood something she hadn't before. Love, in its quietest form, could save a soul, and sometimes it was the ones who seemed most broken who held the greatest power to heal. The morning sunlight filtered softly through the curtains, casting warm stripes across the hardwood floor of Claire's apartment. Outside, the city was stirring, cars rumbling down the street, distant chatter rising with the day's momentum. But inside, there was a quiet calm, a fragile peace that had taken root over months of struggle, hope, and healing. Ash was curled in the corner by the window, his sleek black fur glistening in the light, patches of gray still there but softened now by health and rest. His breathing was steady, the faintest rise and fall beneath the soft blanket he had claimed as his own. Claire sat nearby on the couch, a cup of tea cradled between her hands, watching him with a mixture of awe and tenderness. It was hard to believe how far they'd come. She thought back to that first day at the shelter, when Ash had sat silently in the cage, his eyes wide and wary, as if holding secrets too heavy to share. That quiet, broken cat had seemed so far from the lively companion he was becoming now. Back then, Claire had been lost too, adrift after Luna's passing, her heart bruised and raw. She'd come to the shelter seeking distraction, maybe purpose, but found instead a fragile spark of connection that would ignite a flame she hadn't thought possible. Ash had been more than a rescue. He was a mirror to her own wounds, a companion for her grief and hope alike. Over time, the silence between them had filled with small, meaningful moments. Ash's gentle purrs, the soft padding of his paws on the hardwood, the way he would nuzzle Claire's hand when she was feeling lonely or scared. Those moments were like stitches, sewing their fractured souls back together. Claire smiled as Ash stretched languidly, his eyes locking with hers. In his gaze, she saw not just survival, but trust, something earned through patience and love. Ash's scars told a story, yes, but they were no longer a mark of defeat. They were a testament to resilience, to the quiet strength that exists beneath the surface of those who endure. For Claire, the lessons went deeper. She learned that love wasn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes, it was found in the smallest gestures, a paw reaching out in the dark, a soft gaze shared across a crowded room, the steady presence of a companion who refused to give up. Ash had shown her that healing was not linear. There were setbacks, moments of fear and doubt, but also triumphs that made every step worth it. Together, they had faced the impossible, the threat of loss, the shadow of illness, and emerged not unscathed, but unbroken. As the days passed, Claire found herself sharing their story with others. Friends, neighbors, even strangers on the street stopped to hear about the black cat who had come back from the brink, the woman who refused to let go. Her voice would sometimes falter when she spoke of the dark times, but the message was always clear. There is hope, even when it seems impossible. Ash had become more than a pet or a companion. He was a symbol of second chances, a living reminder that sometimes the quietest beings carry the loudest hearts. On a chilly afternoon, as the first frost of winter painted the city silver, Claire sat at the kitchen table writing a letter. It was addressed to the shelter that had given her Ash. She thanked them for trusting her with a life that had seemed broken, for offering a chance to someone who had so desperately needed it. She wrote of Ash's journey, the limping steps, the hospital nights, the soft victories, and how his presence had mended parts of her she hadn't known were shattered. Her hand paused as she signed her name, a tear slipping onto the paper. That night, Ash curled beside her as she slept, a gentle weight against her side, a living heartbeat steady and sure. Claire felt in that moment a profound gratitude, not just for Ash, but for the unexpected ways life could offer healing, even when hope seemed lost. Months later, standing at the window, Claire watched snowflakes drift lazily from a steel-gray sky. Ash hopped onto the sill beside her, eyes bright and alive. She reached out, fingers brushing his fur softly. A simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. Their story was far from over. But whatever came next, Claire knew one thing with absolute certainty. Love, in its quietest form, could save a soul. And sometimes, it was the ones who seemed most broken who held the greatest power to heal. The small black cat had been a gift, one that had transformed her life in ways she never could have imagined. In the stillness of that winter morning, Claire whispered, "Thank you, Ash, for everything." And Ash, with a soft, steady purr, seemed to say back, "Always." If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and press the bell icon to get daily stories of hope, love, and resilience. Share this with someone who needs a little light today. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Thank you for being here.